Hi.
Hello.
I want to start just with my curiosity because I don't know you, and there's so many, and I'm happy that there are so many, and I'm curious if a few people, one or two, could say what brought you. I know I was just looking at the beautiful poster, and I know you didn't see much about this talk in advance. So can you say anything at all about what called you to come at lunchtime here today? A word that was on the poster or anything that baffled you or called you? Yeah.
Poetry really got me. I know. Yeah, someone came around and gave me a bit more detail, and I've never actually heard of how you can intersect those two things. So that's really cool.
Okay. Thank you. Just the baffled and the curiosity. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I think just thinking about words and how people use them and how they're an expression of a particular kind of meaning in poetry and what we're trying to convey when we write about research or engage in research. So I think it's really about how we think about words and meaning and communicating thoughts, actually.
Yes. The power
Yeah.
of the words themselves, right? The power of the language and what it means. Okay. Thank you for telling me a little. Just gives me a little more connection to you. I actually wrote this as a talk, as a thing to read, but punctuated with things like stories I'm going to tell beyond the reading, and also photographs and poems and a video. So it's kind of a bit of a song and dance. And I would love you to feel free to wave at me if there's something you actually want me to slow down and look at more. I get really excited when I talk about this work, and I want to say everything that I do, and that would be like many days. So I won't, but there'll be time after also for you to ask questions. So I'm going to read what you call the abstract, and then I'll keep going into the stories. Meetings at the Spontaneous Poetry Booth, learnings for research from the experience of a poetry booth. The Spontaneous Poetry Booth is where I sit at a table with a sign that says, "The poet is in." That's it. That's the sign. So I sit at a big table with that sign, and I wait for people. I ask people what they need a poem for, and then I write it on the spot. It's their willingness to ask that opens the door to ask for a poem, and my willingness to open up not knowing whether I'll have anything to offer that makes it work. When a poem works, it can reflect a truth that has not yet been articulated. That encounter lasts about 15 minutes, sometimes less. There's risk in it for both of us. I think this is true in healthcare and in health research. The provider, participant, meets the asker, researcher at a crossroads, and there is hope, expectation, and uncertainty. There's also the possibility that the roles will be reversed. It's not an obvious link to make between writing poems for people and doing research. However, the place that may connect is in the act of asking questions of strangers who may be vulnerable in response. Everything is at stake. In this talk, I tell 3 stories of encounters with people and poetry, at least 3, maybe 20,000. The last story is of a man who asked for a poem at Brave, a festival of risk and failure at Harbourfront Center for the Arts, in 2018. It was less about performing a role or doing a job as about risking being with him and carrying some possibly useful skills. As a poetry practitioner, I have some ideas of what I offer: presence, listening, writing. But ideas and reality aren't the same. How do I meet the person before me? With what judgments and assumptions? And what allows me to shift? This is part talk, part poetry, and part video. Okay. So, last year in 2018, I was invited to this festival called the Festival of Risk and Failure. It was an arts festival. It was a festival at Harborfront where they engaged people in kind of the creative process and people's own experiences of risking. And I was asked to write people poems on the spot, which is what I've been doing for about 10 years in a number of different contexts, at U of T, at Mount Sinai, at a lot of hospitals, also in Europe, like wherever people need this kind of thing, I'll go. I'm very mobile, you can see. So I was given a nice little corner inside. Actually, in truth, there was this big outdoor tent with a huge sign, but then it poured, and so we had to move everything inside. And so I had this sweet little corner inside where people could come and it could be accessible. It wasn't so private, but it was private enough that people could speak quietly. Towards the end of the event, a group of 3 people appeared right before me, huddled together. They looked lost, confused. They spoke haltingly. I wondered if they were okay. Did something happen? I was not there in any capacity as a healthcare professional. I want to just clearly state that. I have been a psychotherapist. I have done work for the hospital, but there I was just the poet there. But I did wonder, what's happening with those folks? Has something happened? So I asked if they needed anything and pointed to the information desk. No, they said, we know. We're from Spain. We want to know what's happening here. Oh, okay, so that was it. They were tourists. They were sort of lost, but they were interested. And then I explained about the poetry booth. And one of the women immediately said, I want this, and she sat down. It's very interesting what happens with people. Some people just come and they're like, I want this. And some people are like anxious, poetry, and they move towards it with the kind of, but she came and she sat down and she told me she just arrived in Canada and that she was scared. Now I did prompt her, right? I just back up here and say that what I do when I sit at the poetry booth, there's so much time I have to act things out, is I sit down. Oh, sorry. Can you still see me? And I'm going to be very unelegant in my skirt. And I sit down deliberately, kind of like that, and so I can land, so people can land, because everybody's anxious, because we're all strangers. You're strangers and I'm strangers. So are the research people you speak to, right? They're strangers. So I land and I say, let yourself land. I know this is really weird. I'm going to ask you a question. You don't have to have a good answer. There's no answer. Just drop into your body and see whatever comes. And I say, what do you need a poem for? And I take some more time, because no one really can believe that I'm asking a question like that. And they think they have to have a quick answer. And I don't want a quick answer. So I wait. And I say, say a few things. Say, it may be messy. You don't have to be articulate. So people say, and they open a little bit. You could feel that, right? As I'm sitting here. I'm going to stand up so the people in the back. Sorry about that, knocking over your drink. Thank you. So then she said, now you know the context of why she answered like that. She said she'd be alone when her friends left in a few days. She just moved here. She's going to be working in Quebec. So I said, what will you do? She said, I'm a cardiologist. Now, are you a little surprised? Yeah, I was a little surprised. Whatever the assumption, expectation I had at that moment's level of vulnerability and chaos, and wasn't that. And so, I wrote her this poem. The cardiologist lands. Very short. You can put your heart in my hands, and I will do everything I know to take care of it. But I know not yet if I can put my heart in your hands. O friend in a new land, welcome me. So, here's the poem. That's exactly what it looked like when I wrote it. I just wrote it. I wrote it. I handed it over to her. I read it to her first. Then she read it. Isn't she lovely? And then I gave it to her. And I took a picture. And that's an exchange. That was the whole thing. Okay. Close this again. Okay. Story 2. So a few years ago, I had a colleague who was undergoing treatment for cancer, and she'd asked if I could come to the chemo unit and prescribe prescribe poems. So here's the other thing. Out of the spontaneous poetry booth, I really should have brought a photograph of me at the booth, the whole kind of sense of it. But if you look on my website, you can see probably some of those photos. There may even be one of me and Matthew, who has been a frequent customer at the poetry booth. The poetry booth variation, in addition to where I'm writing people poems on the spot, is where I prescribe poems on the spot. That is, I'm not writing them like that one. I have poems already printed on prescription pads like that. And then I have many different poems, some all kinds of different poems. Langston Hughes, Emily Dickinson, some of my own poems. Just a huge variety, so that if I'm sitting in front of someone and they ask for a poem, I have a lot to choose from. And depending on the event or what I'm invited to do, I'll do either the spontaneous poetry booth where I'll write the poems, or I'll do the prescriptions. Those are a little bit more quicker, and I sit, of course, with the white coat on because it's the whole shtick. And part of that is, it's playful, but it's also very serious, you know, once you get into the nitty-gritty of what is actually the need. So this friend of mine was undergoing treatment, as I said, and I sat and I gave her some poems. And when we were done with that, wait, let me just pause here and see if I've given you all the info you need. Like the poetry that I write on the spot, the thing about the poem that I'm prescribing is that I wait, I hand it to the person or I read it to the person, and I watch the response. I know if it works. We know in that moment. If someone says, I'm not sure, like maybe, like it hasn't worked, you know, you either it hits or it doesn't. Like it's sort of like a treatment that way. You know, you heard when I read that poem just before, it landed in you in a way. It's an immediate thing. It's not a thinking thing. In both of those circumstances, both where I write the poem and where I prescribe the poem. So their response tells me if it works. Then I sign the prescription and I hand it over, and they can keep it. So after I spent some time with my friend, she needed to rest, and so I walked around the pod, the chemo little pod. Some of you have been in one of those, yes? For yourself or with friends, family. If you haven't been there, there's sort of a small unit where there's 5 or 6 people receiving chemotherapy at the same time, and maybe someone accompanying them. And so, because I was already there, I walked around that little area, and people were sort of curious, but they were definitely in their own spaces, and I carefully asked people if they were willing to meet my eye, did they want a poem? I asked one woman who was sitting in the corner if she wanted a poem, and she said, no, thanks, I'm okay. But when she left, she handed me a poem she wrote while she watched me, while she was having chemo. I'm going to read it to you. This is her poem she wrote. Other people's sounds. His IV pump beeps loudly, repeatedly, to signal the end of his chemo treatment. Doesn't that disturb you? A visitor whispers to her friend, hooked up in the chair next to his. No, you learn to tune out other people's sounds, her friend replies. But I can't tune it out. Come, nurse, I cry inside my head. Come, stop his sound. Come, set him free from that IV pole, from the inflow of toxicity, from this ward full of people with cancer. Come, set him free into the world of healthy people's sounds. Something, eh? She just wrote that sitting there. She gave it to me. And I stayed in touch with her for a few years. We emailed each other, and she kept a poetry blog, and she died last fall. I know. The whole thing, it takes you right up and right down. Yeah, I cry. I mean, really. It's what we're here for, too. Which is also, I imagine, I hope, in some ways what happens in your research. If you're asking real questions of people, they're going to get there. Or in healthcare. What do you do with that? How do you be with that? So, I came away from that day. I didn't have that poem or that story hadn't unfurled yet, but I came away from that day of just sitting in the chemo unit with those folks, and I wrote this poem that I'm going to read you now, called Appointment in Samara. This is from my last book that came out in 2017 called The More, which is very much focused on the work that I've been doing in hospitals and in healthcare. Appointment in Samara. 30 people in chemo today, multiplied by X hospitals in Y countries and Z universes. Back here, H smiles through 4 syringes of chemicals, 2 bags of saline, and a flush of life-giving killer liquid. White-haired sisters in their 70s share clippings of their modeling days with shirtless men in big cars. Take selfies holding up their matching drips. A woman in the corner looks exactly like what is happening to her. Pale and bald, like coal after a fire. Slap me good and hard with mortality while I'm strong. My body wants to run as though it's seen a ghost. The last story, third. Here's my third story. I'm not making light of this. I just want to acknowledge the impact of this I feel in the room. I'm shifting back to an energy that's a little bit lighter, but we went somewhere. I just want to say that, and just make room for some of the feelings here. So at the start of my shift on the second day at the festival, at the Brave Festival, a man was waiting there at the start of the shift. That rarely happens. He was eager. He was very excited. he was so into it that it made me nervous. And just so you know, I think that I'm kind of an open person. But his level of openness kind of scared me. So he was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. He was clean. He was a little bit rumpled. But I could tell that right away he wasn't doing social in the normative way. It wasn't, you know what I mean by that? There wasn't the same kind of polite, there was something different going on here. I wondered if he had mental health issues. I wondered if I was in danger. I wasn't there as a doctor, I wasn't there as a therapist, but a poet, as I've said. So the man, I knew I had to be there. Actually, anyone have a Kleenex?
Get one.
Thanks. Thank you. Oh, I hate to have her miss this. The man whose name is David sat down and he said, I'm ready. My soul is right here. Yes. He held out his hands and I said, I see. Like that. For you, Susan, I have to say this again because you can't miss this part. Thank you.
Do I need one of these?
Yeah. Oh, no, you don't. You may.
Anybody else there?
Yeah, you may.
Is spare.
Yes.
Here.
I just tell you that again. The man sat down and he said, I'm ready. My soul is right here. And he held out his hands. And I looked at them and I could feel that way that you do when you kind of want to be nice but you don't feel very warm and friendly. And my body was going back and I thought I have to get here. This is the job here. Just the job is to get here. And so I thought, you must get over here. And I leaned forward and I knew that he wanted me to touch his hands. And so I leaned forward and I did. And the minute I did that, very strangely, I calmed right down. I'm not being very woo-woo about this. I don't mean that at all, like in any kind of flaky way, although I am a bit. I looked at his eyes and they were very clear and they were very blue and I felt completely fine. And I felt completely grounded. And I just got there. He was wide open. And I asked what he needed a poem for. Wait, now I'll bring him back up because this was after this was after I'd written. You can see I'd already written, so he was right there, but you can feel that. So I asked what he needed a poem for, and his sentences were still quite fragmented, but they suddenly made sense to me. It wasn't like he got more social, in the social way I do social, but I understood, I entered something with him, I connected with him somehow. And they made sense, and I didn't write a poem for him as I've read the poems that I've read to you, I've written. I didn't write a poem the way that I shared the poems I've written so far to you. They were all poems either I wrote or one Barbara wrote. Barbara was the woman who was in the chemo unit. What I did with him was I wrote down as fast as I could what he was saying. And then I read it to him. And I said, what should we call it? That's a new thing I have. Used to be that I'd make up the title, but now I say, read the poem, and then I say, what should we call it? And sometimes they know, and sometimes they don't know. And he said, don't be superficial, because we'll soon find out. That was his title. That was a great title. So here's the poem. I'll read it to you, and then I'll put it up here. Don't be superficial, because we'll soon find out. At one time, there was a death of a father. And at one time, there was a death of a brother. And at one point, there was a brain surgery. And it was all at one moment. And I'm not just of feeling, I'm seeing. I have sight and insight. And I'm here, committed to breathing, joy, and painting until there's nothing left. I believe in peace with yourself. And I need to hear my voice. I hear feelings that are the truth of another. I don't protest. I profess love and the abundance of tomorrow that I may never see. Kind of astonishing, eh? I mean, I don't take any credit. I really heard him what I could. And you hear in that the actual story of what happened to him, which makes sense of why what I understood was, well, what's going on with this man? He had 2 deaths and he had a brain surgery. And I also understood from him in the conversation that he had been a teacher and he probably was already brilliant. But something had opened in him through all of this, both spiritually and in some kind of clinical way, disinhibition, one might say, and all kinds of things that fit into, I'm sure, all kinds of cognitive categories. But it was right there. And then what happened? More happened. There's another piece to this which I had no control over, but just is kind of amazing. I mean, in the end, we had a blast together, right? But the truth was, he was already there. I just got to join him, which sometimes you get to do with a person. And when he left, I gave him the poem, and he had difficulty with memory. Now, how I find this part out is by fluke. A few days later, I was on Google, and I was Googling myself. True enough. And my name comes up with this YouTube. See, it's worth doing sometimes. And this YouTube that I had nothing to do with. And I'm going to play it for you, but I'm going to just tell you the story first. This man had walked out of the festival and walked around the Harbourfront Centre and went for coffee. And then he saw another man, by fluke, who happened to be an extraordinary performance artist, who happened to be in Starbucks. Like, this is just what happened in that moment. And David said to this man, Happy Misha Edwards, I have this poem here that I can't quite read because my handwriting was... Did I show you the handwriting yet? Did I get there?
Yeah.
There. There's my handwriting. So, you know, it's not great for anybody. He couldn't read it. I had given it to him. And he handed it to Happy and said, could you translate this for me because I can't read it? And he ended up talking to this performance artist who, on the spot, made this video. And that is really the end of my presentation, because I don't think I can follow that with anything. But this is my experience, that if I open wide enough, something's going to happen. It's not going to be what I expect. And I might offer something to someone, or they might do something to me, or both, as happened in all of these. But I'll get more information, I'll learn more, I'll experience more, I'll walk away changed. Maybe they will, but that's actually not necessarily my business. Hopefully, well, it is my intention when I give them a poem, I want to offer them something, but I can't know how it's going to happen. I can't have any control over that. All I can do is be there with the most open I can be with the questions I have and the offerings I have, and then be there to receive whatever comes and respond to it. So I hope that that's offers something for you, and I'd love to answer your questions, or you know, be more specific if you have questions about how this might relate or where this came from. But thanks for listening.